Well, you might not know this, but St. Louis is home to one of the most famous haunted houses in America. It's called the Darkness, and it's open year-round down in Soulard. Anybody ever been down to the Darkness in Soulard? Well, the Darkness, yeah, Sally's been to the Darkness, yeah. The Darkness is a haunted attraction in Soulard. It features 27,000 square feet of scare space. Patrons walk around for a couple hours being scared by actors dressed up as ghouls and scary demons and such. And there's a 3D monster scare house or something like that. Now, because of the intricate set design and some of the pneumatic scare technology and the special effects, the Darkness is consistently ranked in the top 10 haunted houses in America. In fact, in 2011, it reached as high as number 2. Now, the creators of the Darkness called the Darkness because of its location. It was built in an abandoned baby carriage factory. I know, sounds scary. And the baby carriage factory originally was called actually the Sunshine Factory, because in the building, there are 400 large windows through which natural light just pours, and by which the workers could make their baby carriages. Now, when the factory was shut down, they boarded up every single one of those windows, creating an incredibly dank, cold, and very, very dark place. And the people who bought it and turned it to the Darkness, they actually thought that that was a perfect metaphor to communicate what they want the Darkness to be. They wanted to be a place where their visitors and patrons feel trapped and overwhelmed by this darkness in which evil and fear are allowed to run rampant. Now, I have never been to a haunted house, and it's not because I'm too much of a wuss. I could totally handle it. Totally. But I've never had any interest, really, in going into a haunted house. I mean, I don't need to go into a haunted house to be reminded of the darkness that is in our world. I am freaked out enough as it is by everything I see on television. There is plenty going around us every day that should terrify us and frighten us much more than 3D monster museums. There is death, there is war, there is sin, there is disease, there is terrorism, there is environmental degradation. We might think we can confine evil to haunted houses down in Soulard, but the world we live in is a very dark place, regardless of where we're at and regardless of what time of day it is. The Darkness, it's all around us. This is Paul's point in chapter 5 of his letter to the Ephesians. If you're just joining us, we are studying Paul's letter to the Ephesians here at Rooftop this spring. If you don't recognize the name Paul was an early missionary in the first century. He was an eyewitness of the resurrected Christ. And he was so excited about that he traveled around the Mediterranean starting different churches. And he would write them these long letters to stay in touch with them. And some of these letters have been collected for us in the New Testament. This letter to the Ephesians is one of them. And we're calling our study of Ephesians Under Construction because, as we've seen, one of the themes of Ephesians is that God is always building up his people. We are constant works in progress, which is why our lives are always a little bit of a mess, right? Because God's working on us. He ain't done with us yet. Sorry to quote a bumper sticker, but it's incredibly true. Now, this morning, I want to look at a passage with you from Ephesians in which Paul warns us of the darkness of the world in which we live. He cautions us to be aware of the way the darkness can corrupt our lives, and he challenges us to live lives of light that can transform the warehouse in which we are stuck back into the sunshine factory that it originally was. So let me go ahead and read to you then Ephesians chapter 5, verses 3 through 14. But among you, there must not be even a hint of sexual immorality, or any kind of impurity or greed, because these are improper for God's holy people. Nor should there be obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking, which are out of place, but rather thanksgiving. For of this you can be sure. No immoral, impure, or greedy person, such a person is an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of such things God's wrath comes on those who are disobedient. Therefore, do not be partners with them. For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light, for the fruit of the light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. And find out what pleases the Lord. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. It is shameful even to mention what the disobedient do in secret. But everything exposed by the light becomes visible, and everything that is illuminated becomes a light. This is why it is said, "Wake up, sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you." Now, in this section of Ephesians, Paul is explaining to us how our lives should look differently from the world. As we've said, in the first half of Ephesians, Paul teaches us what is true. There's a lot of theology in the first half of Ephesians, where Paul teaches us what is true about God, about the church, about us, about Jesus. And in the second half of Ephesians, the half that we're in now, he explains sort of what the implications of all that are, how we should be living our lives differently, consequently. And here in this passage, to sum it up a little bit, he says that we should be living lives of light. Paul's sort of chosen metaphor for this passage is that of light and dark, as he says in verse 8, "For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light." Now, this is actually not the only place in Ephesians where Paul uses this metaphor of light and dark. In fact, later in the book in chapter 6, he tells us that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, this dark world. In Paul's mind, the world that we live in is a dark place of evil, sin, and hopelessness. It's like the dark world in Thor 2, the dark world, where the evil elf creatures planned their rebellion under cover of darkness on the dark planet before arriving to Earth and nearly destroying London, before it was saved by a brilliant supermodel physicist, Natalie Portman. But it was close. Throughout history and in the Bible, darkness represents the ultimate evil. It's a place of loneliness and fear and death. The darkness is where criminals go to plot their deeds. The darkness is where cockroaches go to copulate. The darkness is where demons go to smoke their cigars and play their card games. As Paul writes, it is shameful to mention what the disobedient do in secret in the darkness. I know some of you might be nocturnal sorts. You do your best work at night. And I mean no offense to you or to your fellow nocturnal creatures. Bats, owls, possums. They're just trying to live their nocturnal lives, so I mean no offense. But as a literary device, the darkness represents all that is corrupt and foul, and our world, according to Paul, is awash in darkness. But if our world is the darkness, Jesus is the light. He enters our world to give it life and hope. In John 8, Jesus actually introduces himself as the light of the world. I am the light of the world. And he says, anybody who follows me will not walk in the darkness, but will have the light of life. So if the darkness represents all that is evil and corrupt in our world, the light represents holiness and life. And Jesus came to bring us light. Jesus came to bring us life in a world of death, hope in a world of despair, joy in a world of sorrow. He came to show us love in a world of hate. Jesus is our light. Jesus is our beacon. Jesus is our bonfire. Jesus is our LED flashlight. Jesus is our bat signal. Jesus is our light of Elendil. That's from Lord of the Rings. Now, Paul's point in Ephesians, though, is that it's not just Jesus who is the light in this dark world. It's not just Jesus who wants to light up the factory and return it to the sunshine condition that it was in. It's not just Jesus who is that. It's us too. Jesus wants to light up the factory, but he wants to do it through us. As Paul says in verse 8, "But you are light in the Lord. Live as children of the light." So Jesus wants to flood the factory with his light, but he wants to do it through us. He wants to shine his light through us. Now, to be precise, and precision matters, to be precise, we are not the light. Jesus is the light. Jesus wants to reflect his light off of our lives into the world. Jesus wants to light up the world by lighting us up. So we are not suns that shine on the earth. We are moons, rather, that reflect the sun's light onto the dark planet on which we live. As Paul writes in verse 13, everything that is illuminated becomes a light. He wants to illuminate the world by illuminating us, by reflecting his light off of us, as though we are moons, not suns. Hopefully we are bright, full moons. Have you ever been outside at night on a clear night with a bright, full moon up there? You can see everything. It's like it's the middle of the day. Hopefully we are bright, full moons reflecting all of God's radiance and all of God's glory into our very dark world. But of course, you know that the moon has different phases. Some of us might not be bright, full moons. We might be maybe more gibbous moons. You know what a gibbous moon is? It's a moon that's almost getting there. It's close. You know, our light might be growing. We might be a gibbous moon. We might be a waxing gibbous moon, getting bigger. We might be a waning crescent moon. We got a little bit of light and we're losing it. A waxing crescent moon. Or we might be in a state of lunar eclipse. We might be stuck behind the earth, unable to receive the sun's light. No one can see anything by our lives. Some of you might be completely eclipsed. Regardless, that's how Jesus intends to bring light into the world, by shining it, reflecting it off of us. As Paul says at the end of the passage, he says, "Wake up, sleeper, rise from the dead. Christ will shine on you." That's how he wants to flood the factory with light and return it to the sunshine factory condition that it was in, by reflecting his light off of our lives. Now, how does he do that? Enough with the light-dark metaphor. What's this going to look like in really practical details? How does he want to flood the factory of the world with light reflected off of our lives? Well, that's what Paul talks about in this passage. Paul explains here in this passage how Jesus wants to radiate himself off of us into our worlds, our communities, our families. He mentions two ways that we, God's people, can be lights in a very dark factory. First, we can and should avoid deeds of darkness. If we want to bring light to the world, we should avoid deeds of darkness. In verse 11, Paul writes, "Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness." Have nothing to do with them, he says. Avoid them at all costs, these fruitless deeds of darkness. Don't even touch them with a 10-foot pole. Avoid the deeds of darkness. Now, what are the deeds of darkness? He says in verse 3, "Among you there must not be even a hint of sexual immorality, or of any kind of impurity, or of greed, because these are improper for God's holy people. Nor should there be obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking, which are out of place, but rather thanksgiving." So these are the deeds of darkness: sexual immorality, impurity, greed, obscenity, foolish talk, coarse joking. These are, Paul says, improper for God's holy people. For people saved by Jesus and made saints in his kingdom, it doesn't look right to behave these ways. It's improper. It's kind of like seeing royalty misbehave. It's improper for royalty to misbehave. It's like seeing Prince Harry from Great Britain, dressed up as a Nazi at a costume party, or snorting cocaine, or leering at women in bikinis, or any of the other many number of misdeeds that Prince Harry has been caught on film doing. It's just improper for royalty to be seen behaving badly. We're royalty. We're God's saints. We're his representatives here on earth. Sin doesn't look good on us. Sin doesn't look good in general, but certainly not on his saints. What I find especially intimidating about this verse, though, is the very high bar that Paul sets here. He says that, "Among you there must not be even a hint of sexual immorality, or any kind of impurity. That's an incredibly high bar. Not even a hint of sexual immorality or any kind of impurity. Not a smidge of greed, not a scintilla of obscenity, not a hair's breadth of hatred. Nothing. Not even a whiff of sin. Now, why not? As he says, for because of such things, God's wrath comes on those who are disobedient. God hates sin in any measure. Big sins, little sins. For because of such things, God's wrath comes on those who are disobedient. God hates sin, large and small. I hate mushrooms. Big ones and little ones. I hate the large portobello mushrooms, and I hate the tiny little mushrooms that my mom makes really small to try and slide into the casserole without me knowing. I hate onions. Big ones, Vandalia onions, those huge ones in Georgia that they grow, and little onions, like the tiny little ones that they put on your cheeseburger at McDonald's. Can't stand them. Superman hates kryptonite. Big chunks of kryptonite and tiny little vials of kryptonite. He hates them both. God hates sin in any measure. Large chunks of sin, tiny little vials of sin. He hates it. We should too. Sadly, you know as well as I do, we don't. We tell ourselves that as long as we're not committing big sins like adultery or murder, we're doing fairly well. We'll let little sins go like lustful thoughts, snarky comments, tiny little moments of greed, those tiny little ones, when you make the conversation about yourself, or when you grab that last potato without asking if anyone else wants it. Tiny little moments of greed. But little sins are as much a stain on God's holiness as the big ones are. If you get a stain on your dress, on your pure, beautiful, perfect dress, you get a stain on your dress, it's ruined whether or not the stain is big or small. God's standard for his people is not lives that are pretty good. You got to understand this in order to understand basic Christian theology. God's standard for his people is moral perfection. God's standard for his people is divine moral perfection. That's what Jesus says. He says, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. That's why we got to hate sin in any portion. A friend of mine here at Rooftop has what he calls an Ephesians 5:4 jar that he keeps at home with his roommates. If you remember Ephesians 5:4, it's that there should be no obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking. So every time they say something rude or offensive or crass, they have to donate $1 into the Ephesians 5:4 jar, and if there's a dispute, I actually think they take a vote. And then after the jar has been filled up, they take all the money and they donate to one of their favorite charities. I believe they make very frequent donations. I told them I actually think that's kind of cool, but I don't know if it's properly incentivized. You see, you should want to give money to your favorite charity. But according to the system, the better behaved you are, the less money you donate to your favorite charity, which is a bad thing. I told them that I recommended that, in order to properly incentivize this, you should pledge to donate the money to, like, your least favorite charity of all time. Like Nazi Atheists of America or something. That would really disincentivize coarse joking. I can't say that. I'm going to be supporting the Nazi atheists. Be that as it may, I told them I loved the attention to detail. God doesn't want to hear a hint of foulness from us. It is for these deeds that Jesus sacrificed his life into his own jar. No sin befits a saint. And sin in any proportion dulls our radiance. Sin are like sunspots on the surface of our sun. Do you know that the sun actually increases or decreases in its brightness based on the presence of sunspots on its surface? Sin is like sunspots that dull our radiance into a dark world. We shine less when there is sin in our life. Now, of course, I want to make this incredibly clear. There is grace. God forgives big sins and little ones. His standards are exacting, but his mercy and his forgiveness are great. In fact, God's mercy, grace, and forgiveness are among the brightest things in the universe. But he doesn't lower his standards to accommodate our sin. He forgives it, but he doesn't lower his standards. If we want to flood the factory with the light of Christ, we need to avoid the deeds of darkness in any portion. That's first. Secondly, if we want to shine God's light into the world, we need to practice deeds of light. It's not enough to avoid deeds of darkness. We need to practice deeds of light. We're not going to light up the world by not sinning. We have to replace it with lives of holiness. As Paul writes in verse 4, nor should there be any obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking, which are out of place, but rather thanksgiving. It's not enough to not say foolish things. It's not enough to not joke coarsely. We have to practice other things like thanksgiving. Instead of rudeness, practice gratitude. Instead of sarcasm, try being sincere. You've heard the saying, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. Did anybody else's mother tell them that like 20 times a day? If you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. I think that gets it half right. If you don't have anything nice to say, find something nice to say, and then say that. If you don't have anything nice to say, dig deep. Get creative. Brainstorm. Get out the dry erase board. Write out some ideas. Pick one that is nice, friendly, and encouraging, and helpful, and kind, and say that. Holiness is not the absence of sin. Holiness is the presence of righteousness. There's a difference. Holiness is not the absence of sin. Holiness is the presence of goodness and righteousness. As Paul continues in verse 8, he says, "For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light. For the fruit of the light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. Find out what pleases the Lord." We are children of light. Jesus died to make us children of light. Don't do deeds of darkness. Live lives of light. Live according to who we are. Lives of light that are marked by the fruit of light, goodness, righteousness, and truth. That's the sort of thing that stands out in our dark world. Lives of goodness, lives of service, like we're talking about doing this upcoming weekend, the Urban Plunge. We do something like this every year. We got to get everybody together and we go out and serve in the community. We call it different names. Urban Plunge this year. We've done Be the Church Day in the past. We've done Make a Difference Day in the past. Those sorts of things stand out in our dark world. In fact, I was meeting with a group of community leaders a couple weeks ago around here, and we're talking about some upcoming service events, and people still remember our Make a Difference Day 5 years ago. People are still talking about how many rooftoppers we had walking up and down Gravois picking up trash. People remember that sort of thing. That sort of thing stands out. It shines out. If you commit your life to living a life of goodness, to serving other people, to saying positive, encouraging things to other people, people will notice. In our dark world, it's like what Paul says in the book of Philippians. Be blameless and pure, children of God without fault, crooked and depraved generation, in which you shine like stars in the universe. In a world caught in the darkness, lives of goodness really do shine. The verse I really like in this passage, though, is what Paul writes in verse 8. He tells us to find out what pleases the Lord. That's what he writes. Find out what pleases the Lord. People of light find out what God likes. Paul's point here, again, is that righteous living is not the absence of sin. Righteous living is finding out what pleases God and doing it. This is important because a lot of us plead ignorance when it comes to the quality of our lives, living for God. We excuse our bad, immoral decisions or our lack of spiritual initiative. We excuse it on the basis that, well, God could have been more clear. We didn't know any better. I don't know what it looks like to live righteously. But God puts the responsibility on us to find out what pleases God and do it. God has a better idea of what will make us happier and what will light up our world better, and we should find out what it is. God gives us very general principles of goodness, truth, and righteousness, but we got to find out what that looks like in our own daily lives. For example, a few weeks ago, I was taking a day off. I try to take Mondays off. Sometimes it works. And I went up to Redbox to grab a couple movies that I've been meaning to see. I love watching movies. And I wanted to go grab a couple movies that I've been intending to see. One of them was Trainwreck with Amy Schumer. I hear it's incredibly funny. And it's kind of a witty social commentary sort of thing. But I'm sure it's rather raunchy. You know, it's a comedy starring Amy Schumer. But, you know, I like a good comedy, and I like staying up to speed on pop culture, and I'm an adult, so I can handle, you know, rated R movies. I put it in, though, and it just didn't feel right. I thought, well, you know, this is my guilt complex. I walk around feeling guilty most of the time, so that's not a problem. But I actually decided to pause, literally pause, and find out what pleases the Lord. Sure enough, it occurred to me, on such a precious thing as a day off, there are 20,000 better ways I could spend my time, like reading, napping, watching a backup movie. I actually had a backup movie in case that one didn't work out. My brain was thinking ahead. It turned out to be much more beneficial and uplifting and positive. 20,000 more better ways I could spend my time than watching a movie that I would never let my kids watch. Yeah, you know, I haven't seen Trainwreck, but my life is not the worse for it. Not falling, you know, behind pop culture because I didn't spend 2 hours watching Amy Schumer run around naked. Righteousness isn't always obvious. We have to think about it. We got to find out what it looks like. If we want to flood the factory with light, we got to find out what pleases the Lord in every situation. I mean, what movie should I watch today? What would God want me to say to this person? How would Jesus want me to spend my night? What does God want me to do with my weekend? How would God be pleased for me to spend my money? How would the Spirit lead me to serve my family? How would God want me to make this decision? God knows better than us on these things. Our ability to light up the world depends on our willingness to find out from what God wants from us. And then with the help of the Spirit, relying on the mercy of God, of course, doing those things. So that's how Paul says we can flood the factory with light and remake it into the sunshine factory that originally was, by avoiding deeds of darkness, practicing deeds of light. As we do that, that's how the Lord Jesus reflects his light off of our lives into the world and makes a difference in the world we live. That's how it happens. It happens through us. By avoiding deeds of darkness, practicing deeds of light. So, question, how bright is your life? What's your apparent magnitude? What are the sins bespotting your sun? Have you been forgiven for those? Are you repenting of those? What's your lunar phase? Are you a bright full moon? Are you gibbous, crescent? Are you waxing? Are you waning? Are you in a state of eclipse? And far more importantly, how are you letting the Lord Jesus reflect his light off of your life? Reflect his light off of your life into a very dark world, stuck wandering around terrified in the darkness.